This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy. Buying joint venture. If a man wanted to buy a boat to go into the fishing business and didn't have the necessary money, but had a good deal of experience, chances are he could work out a deal. He would go to a bank and ask for money, say £500. Upon establishing the fact that he had 20 years' experience, the bankers might risk some of their investors' money with him. The bank would buy the boat and hire him as captain with a salary. At the end of the first year, he could be given the option to buy 10% of the business. If he took up the option, he would then own 10% of the business and get 10% of the profits. The bank would get 90% for their investors. The second year, he might buy another 10%. He would then own 20% of the business and get 20% of the profits. If the bank thought he was doing a poor job, they might fire him and hire another captain. He would still get 20% of the profits since he owned 20% of the boat. If the boat sank, insurance covered it. The bank got a fee for its services, that's all, not a large fee either. Another way to handle the same boat contract was on a rental basis. The bank's investors would buy the boat and rent it to the buyer. The buyer kept all the profits and paid rent to investors. There might be an option to buy the boat. The type of contract which could be drawn was limited only by the imagination. One thing, it had to be fair. No one will go into a contract which doesn't seem fair to both sides, especially if the deal is being watched by the Christian community. In the way illustrated above, in 10 years, the buyer could own his ship without having to put up any money of his own. Of course, the 10-year contract is only given as an illustration. Practically, there were no such contracts that went past 7 years. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release, as in cancellation of debts, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it, cancel the debt. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner, in Hebrew, zur, or racial alien, thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother thine hand shall release. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1-3. The house buyer. If a man wanted to buy a house, the same sort of business arrangement could be made. He might have £10 of his own for a down payment. He would go to the bank and ask for a loan for the balance. The bank would send out an appraiser to find out if the house was really worth the discussed purchase price of perhaps £100. If it was, a deal could be struck. The man, by putting up his £10, might own 10% of the house, and the bank 90% by putting up £90. The buyer also paid rent. He received 10% of his own rent because he owned 10% of the house, and the bank received 90%. The next year, he bought another 10% and owned 20%. He then received 20% of the rent. The bank owned 80% and received 80% of the rent. Each year, the bank allowed him to buy more of the house. In time, he owned it all. If he failed to pay the rent, he was evicted and another renter or buyer installed. He still received 20% of the rent because he owned 20% of the house. Being kicked out did not deprive him of what was already his. Of course, the contract might specify that any new buyer or renter could have the option to buy his 20% share also. What is fair or not fair is much easier determined when one does not have wild market swings brought about by interest-caused inflation or deflation, i.e. the house being worth £100 this year, $200 the next year, and dropping to $50 the year after. In that day, they had nothing comparable to the booms and busts that are the rule today. It is said that the price of bread remained the same for 4 centuries in the Hanseatic League. Determining usury contracts. In a no-interest contract, there is always risk for both partners. If the risk factor is all on one side, the church determined whether it was a usury or non-usury contract. The usury contract makes one side risk-free and eventually ruins the borrower, as it was designed to do. The no-interest contract shares the risk. Both parties rise or fall together. This is one of the oldest rules of canon law in determining whether or not a contract was a usury contract, as an equal risk. Early bank failures. For many years, the private bankers did most of the business for merchants and kings. practically all of which was interest-free. Problems could and did arise in a private banker's dealings with kings. If the king politely requested a private banker to make a loan to him, the private banker did, or came under his displeasure. The problem was compounded if the king rode off to war and got himself killed. In these cases, the debt was seldom paid and the private banker was ruined. On other occasions, the private bankers might allow good merchant customers to borrow from him to cement their relationship. If the merchant wasn't able to repay, the banker was in trouble. During one 42-year period following the expulsion of the Jews from England and France, the following Italian banks were ruined for lack of specie to honor their obligations. 1304, Francosi Company. 1312, the Macchi. 1315, Frescobaldi. 1320, Cerchi Bianchi. 1343, Peruzzi Company. 1345, Acciaiuoli. 1346, Bardi. The banking houses of Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence failed when Richard III of England went bankrupt following the 100 Years' War with France. Wooden tallies were fine at home, but gold was needed for foreign wars. Kings and their governments could make wooden tallies, but they couldn't make gold. They ruined many private bankers by their forced loans to obtain it. The existence of the non-usurious private banks was further endangered by the arrival of Marrano usury bankers from Spain, starting in 1492. These people quickly made alliances with local rulers desperate for cash. Soon, the combined activities of ruler, preference, and usurers siphoning off the floating money supply put most of the private bankers and many of the merchants out of business. It also brought on depression and unemployment. The failure of a bank was a serious event. The repercussions went far beyond the individuals involved. Trade treaties between cities and countries could be jeopardized, and entire manufacturing industries shut down if the financing of the operations ceased. To prevent powerful merchants and princes and newly arrived usury bankers from putting undue pressure on private banks, the cities of Europe took over the banking business by establishing municipal banks. Chapter 13. The Municipal Bank of Amsterdam. The most famous of the city-run banks was the Great Bank of Amsterdam. This interest-free bank was established in 1609. Since half of Europe's commerce was carried in Dutch ships, Amsterdam had need of such a bank. This was the largest and wealthiest bank in the world. Its main purpose was to facilitate and expedite trade. It did not make loans for its own account. If a captain had a ship's cargo and no crew, he might come to the Bank of Amsterdam. The bank might locate investors who would be willing to invest the needed money to hire a crew for 20% of the profits of the voyage. If a captain needed a cargo, he might lease his ship to bank investors for the length of its expected voyage and hire himself on as captain with a bonus of 15% of the profits. The bank got a moderate fee for arranging these deals. If the ship was lost at sea, like the other such contracts, it was insured. Chests of gold would come in the front door of the bank in the morning and leave by the rear door that evening. Gold was considered a commodity to be traded. It could be stored for future use, or it could be used for the backing for gold deposit receipts. Municipal banks were large, powerful, efficient operations. Their advent pushed private banks into the background for a time. The age. The 4 centuries lasting from the 1200s through the 1500s is a most misunderstood period. The establishment, with reason, wishes to portray the period as being one of poverty, tyranny, dirt, and backwardness. Such was hardly the case. The greatest display of a nation's wealth, cathedrals, were built all over Germany, France, and England during that period. The skilled labor was mostly volunteer. Thorold Rogers, professor at Oxford University in the middle of the last century, wrote, "At that time, a laborer could provide all the necessities for his family for a year by working 14 weeks. The rest of the time was his to do as he pleased. Many parts of Europe were so prosperous during the 14th century that hundreds of communities averaged between 160 to 180 holidays a year. Some labored for themselves, some studied, some fished, others volunteered their labor to build these massive structures. Lord Leverhulme, writing at the same time, said, 'The men of the 15th century were very well paid.' While today one may find a few score visitors at one of the great cathedrals, Cobbett, in his history of the Reformation, states that our ancestors had the wealth and leisure for 100,000 pilgrims. For 100,000 pilgrims at a time to visit Canterbury and other shrines. This from a land that contained 1/10 today's population. The same William Cobbett recorded in his Rural Rides that when he viewed Winchester Cathedral, he said, "That building was made when there were no poor rates, when every laboring man in England was clothed in good woolen cloth, and when all had plenty of meat and bread. This was an age peopled mostly by those who had repented. Most neither took usury nor gave it. There was no pressure of due bills. As a consequence, the lands were with material and spiritual wealth. The municipal banks, the creation of the people, fought usury banks tooth and nail. It was not until the advent of Napoleon, the hatchet man of the usury bankers, that municipal banks were shut down permanently."